Max Verstappen falters for the first time in 2 years as he suffered a mechanical DNF, and with this Carlos Sainz was able to capitalise, taking his third career win in a dominant display, whilst Mercedes put on an absolute disaster class. Let's dive into the Australian Grand Prix. The Australian Grand Prix, whilst perhaps not your typical 10 out of 10 banger, I think was the best race we've had of 2024 so far, and had a couple interesting talking points coming out of it. The most prominent has to be Max Verstappen's early DNF. Verstappen took an unlikely pole position on Saturday as both Ferraris looked stronger throughout Q1 and Q2. However, as Verstappen always seems to be able to do these days, he managed to find an extra couple of tenths when it mattered most and was able to take pole by a roughly 2.5 tenths, 2-ish tenths. Verstappen is driving incredibly well at the moment and always seems ready to deliver and pull a lap out of the bag when he needs to. Sainz put together a nice lap to bring it home in P2, and while Sergio Perez qualified in P3, he had a 3-place grid drop for impeding during Q1, which dropped him to P6, bumping Norris up to P3, Leclerc to P4, and Piastri to P5. It's just a small error that Sergio doesn't really need in his qualifying that has been his weaker point over the previous couple of years in comparison to Verstappen. And he doesn't need a grid penalty, especially when he's actually qualified decently this season. Putting it on the second row whilst his teammate takes pole, alright, it's not the best, but it's decent, and it's just what he didn't need in that moment. Leclerc also had a disappointing qualifying. It looked like he would be in the fight for pole, but he couldn't even finish his final Q3 lap. He just said the balance was all off on his final runs, and unfortunately Verstappen just took pole. He just pulled out that lap out of the bag like he always seems to be able to do. Verstappen led into the first corner, and I thought that would be it. Verstappen's going to drive off into the distance and equal his record of 10 race wins in a row. But Sainz was able to keep up over the first 2 and 3 laps and actually managed to make a move around the outside into the turns 9-10 chicane on the back straight. At this stage, I think we all thought we had a nice race on our hands, but as Verstappen came past me in the grandstand on the next lap, I was sitting at the turns 1-2 on the inside. We could all start to see smoke billowing out of his right rear tyre, and the smoke kept increasing in volume over the next couple laps, and at that point he eventually slowed down, had to retire, and pulled into the pits. But it wasn't exactly as simple as that, as he was driving down the fast lane, there was a large explosion out of his tyre. Luckily, no one was standing around when he happened, and it wasn't in the actual pits itself, but it was a gigantic explosion and was definitely not something Red Bull wanted. We later found out that it was his right rear brake was actually still being applied pressure to even when he wasn't on the brake pedal. So this started from the beginning of the race, and it meant that that right rear brake was just slowly increasing in temperature until it started to catch fire and cause Verstappen to make mistakes, as of course the last thing you want to be doing is braking and having a brake that's hotter than all the others, because originally it'll make it perform better, but then as it gets too hot it'll start to perform worse, and you just won't be able to get the best out of the car, which is what happened to Verstappen. He locked up into turn 3, and that allowed Sainz to get close and make a move down the back straight. Red Bull hasn't had any of these issues before. There was no indication of it before on the grid or on the warm-up laps to the grid, so we don't really know what's caused it. We'll have to wait for a statement from Red Bull themselves really to find out. But Verstappen seemed very calm when he was speaking to the media afterwards. He knows he's got a good car this year, and stuff like this is always eventually going to happen. As I said before, it's been 2 years since his last mechanical DNF, coincidentally in the Australian race in 2022. So I think he's confident he'll be more than in the hunt when it comes to Japan in 2 weeks' time. With Verstappen out of the race, that left the door wide open from anyone from Ferrari, McLaren, Aston Martin, and of course Sergio Perez, I couldn't also forget the Mercedes as well, to take this opportunity with both hands. In the end though, it was the Ferraris and the McLarens that seemed to have the best pace this weekend and were left to duel it out for the win. I think everyone, including myself at this stage, thought we would probably be in for a bit of a classic race given that Verstappen was out. But in all honesty, there wasn't really much close racing, especially between the Ferraris and McLarens who finished in the top 4 in the end. There just seemed to be a really distinct pace order throughout the day, and the cars were already in that order when the race started, so there just wasn't going to be that much overtaking. Sainz was clearly the quickest and most clinical today. He was able to run longer than his teammates and the McLarens on that first stint, which gave him a nice tyre offset, and it also meant he was able to box, because of his superior pace, he was able to box later, come out on fresher tyres and still hold his position, his track position that is, and in the end, it was a very well-deserved win. He drove extremely well. It seemed like he was struggling with tyres in the final couple of laps. He came on the radio and said they were feeling a bit off. Leclerc closed the gap to around 2.3 seconds, 1.5 seconds as he crossed the line down from 6 in the final 2 or 3 laps, but Sainz had built a big enough gap to be able to coast the line and really not have to worry about being caught. So I don't think he had a major issue. I just think he was being careful. He had the win in the bag at this stage. Leclerc wasn't going to pass him unless he suddenly had an engine failure or he blew a tyre. So I think Sainz was just coasting at this stage. And of course, he was able to lead home a historic 1-2 for Ferrari, their first since Bahrain in 2022, funnily enough. The McLarens looked to be Ferrari's closest challenger today, but they still weren't quick enough to actually really challenge the Ferraris. Norris was clearly the quicker McLaren driver. He did qualify ahead of Leclerc, but was jumped by him at the start. I think if Leclerc got his lap together in Q3, he would have been ahead of Norris anyway. Whilst Norris was able to keep the Ferraris in sight, more specifically Leclerc in sight, I don't think he had the pace to make an overtake even if he got into DRS range and even if there was another 10 laps or so in the race. Piastri also had a really solid race. He followed Norris home. There was a bit of a gap, maybe 15 seconds or so. He did have a small mistake. He locked up into the penultimate corner. It cost him around 10 seconds or so, but other than that, it was a really strong performance from him. Of course, the McLarens did have team orders throughout the race during the midpoint, but I think this was completely fine. Norris qualified ahead. He was quicker and he was on the fresher tyres. So I think the swap was quite clearly warranted, even though I am Australian. I would have loved to see Piastri on the podium. Piastri himself even admitted in his post-race interviews that he thought the swap was definitely fair enough, and he had no complaints with it. Mercedes, on the other hand, had an absolute shocker this weekend. Firstly, they just completely lacked the pace of Perez, the McLarens, and Ferraris, and seemed like they were in a fight with the Aston Martins, really. And on a day that they would be wanting to capitalise with Verstappen retiring, they just weren't able to. They weren't in the mix really at all. Hamilton has struggled all weekend with rear instability. Sitting at turns 1 and 2, I saw him go off plenty of times, going deep on the brakes and going through the runoff. And he could only really qualify 11th, which just isn't good from him at all. I think it was his worst qualifying performance at Australia since like 2010, 2011 or something. Anyway, I could be wrong with that. But it was his worst qualifying performance in a very long time. He started on the softs, didn't really make up any ground on them. They didn't really seem to be a good race tyre at all. And then was on the hards, closing in on Lance Stroll when his engine decided it wanted to end his weekend prematurely. It had had enough of this awful weekend it had been having and packed up on lap 17. This wasn't a good weekend at all for Lewis. He seemed to really be struggling with the rear end of the car in a similar fashion to last year, a weakness that Mercedes had thought they had fixed when they came away from Bahrain, but was then again exposed in Jeddah. So he'll be looking to bounce back in Japan in 2 weeks. Of course, Japan wasn't a good track for Mercedes last year. They really struggled for the turned Sector 1 S's, I should be saying. So we'll see if they can bounce back, but Lewis will definitely be hoping for a more competitive weekend in comparison to at least his teammate George Russell. Whilst Russell was much quicker than his teammate all weekend and was having the much better weekend overall, he also has nothing to show for it too, given he crashed out in a very, very dramatic crash on the final lap of the race, chasing Fernando Alonso down for, I believe it was P6. Initially, it looked like Russell had lost the car all by himself, going too deep on the brakes, locking the rears and sliding off into the gravel. But since the end of the race, evidence then surfaced suggesting Fernando may have brake checked him. They went to a stewards meeting, and basically the end result was that Fernando received a drive-through penalty, which was converted to a 20-second time penalty because, of course, the race was over. He couldn't do the drive-through, and that dropped him from P6 to P8. My personal view on this issue there is that, yes, Fernando and any driver should be able to vary their line. That was Fernando's defense. He wanted to try a different line going into this corner as he wanted to get a better exit. It was the final lap. He was trying to defend his position, but I don't think they should be able to vary their line by a huge, drastic amount, which, in my opinion, Fernando did. Fernando got off the accelerator 100 meters earlier than what he had in all the previous other laps, and in my opinion, that does come under the ruling of erratic or dangerous driving. There's no way Russell can predict for Fernando to do that. Okay, changing your line by like braking 20 meters earlier or something, getting on the throttle 10 meters earlier. That's fine. That's racing. It's good defending. But 100 meters off before you usually brake seems a bit like a brake check, and that he was trying to back Russell up. And as I thought, he was clearly trying to back Russell up at this stage through the corner so he could give Russell more dirty air. He could get a better exit and Russell would get a poor exit. And whilst, of course, you can't blame Fernando for the crash, there was no contact. It was just the extra dirty air that Russell got from being that close to Fernando that caused the crash. You can still suggest that Fernando was driving erratically, which is what the stewards ended up concluding in the end. So whilst the penalty, it was harsh, 20 seconds is a lot. Maybe I would have given him a 10-second penalty if I was in the stewards room. I can see how the stewards did end up coming to that conclusion. If you want more detail on it, the stewards released their document. It's very in-depth. It's like a page long. It probably gives a better explanation than what I have. And of course, I would also recommend checking out the Race F1's YouTube video on it. It was very insightful. It's got a lot of data. But let me know if you think Fernando deserved the penalty down below in the comments. So now, moving on to the top 10 finishes. Of course, you have Sainz in P1, Leclerc P2, Norris P3, and Piastri P4. I've already talked about them a lot. You have Perez, who finished in P5, and I think he had a bang alright average race. It's really hard to judge, given Verstappen wasn't in the race, so we don't have a benchmark, a teammate comparison for a pace comparison between Verstappen and Perez. I think that penalty, that grid drop he got before the race even started, really ruined any chance he had of fighting at the top, as he got stuck behind slower cars on his first stint, and it took him a while to work his way through them. Perez said post-race, even if Verstappen was still in the race, he didn't think Verstappen would have won it. He thought the Ferraris had more than enough pace to cover them off, but it's something I guess we'll never really know. I still think his performance was a big subpar, though. Verstappen was able to put it on pole, and he was 3/10 off back in P3. But then again, it's Checo. No disrespect to Checo, but that's usually where he tends to qualify behind Verstappen. But most importantly, he failed to do what Red Bull has set for him. If they wanted him to be in a position to pick up the pieces when Verstappen fails, Verstappen has a crash, he has a DNF. They want him to be there to pick up that race win. So if Verstappen's P1, they want him a comfortable P2 to pick up those pieces. I think he should have been at least on the podium today. I definitely do. Yeah, it's an alright race from Perez, but he wasn't there to do what Red Bull wanted him to do. So tough one to judge. I'd probably give it a bit subpar. Now, you had Lance Stroll in P6. I really don't have much to add to Lance. He's basically a bit slower than Fernando, but quicker than the bottom 5 teams. So he finished basically where I thought he would. He jumps a couple of spots at the end because of the Russell DNF and the Alonso penalty. So he finished a bit higher than he would have otherwise would, but I think it was a bang on where I thought Lance Stroll should be finishing and where I think he will be finishing for the rest of the year. Yuki Tsunoda came home in P7 with an absolutely outstanding drive, and this all started yesterday when he maximised that car in qualifying and allowed him to use his race pace to stay out of grasp of the other bottom 5 teams, such as the Haas, who seem to have decent pace today. He made some overtakes and should be very, very happy with how he performed. He was clearly best of the rest, and he's still making his case for that Red Bull seat very strong. Alonso again came home in P8 because of his penalty, and then you had Hülkenberg and Magnussen in P9 and P10 respectively, with a nice double points finish for Haas. Given where they expected to be at the beginning of the year, they've had an outstanding start under Komatsu, and they should be very pleased with what they've managed to achieve so far this year with 3 points, while lots of other teams still haven't managed to score. The car looks to have decent race pace, which was the main weakness they had to fix going in from last year, and they've been executing strategy well, and I think the drivers have been performing decently, or at least one driver's been performing well each weekend. So yeah, a very good start to the year for Haas, and hopefully they can keep this momentum going into Japan. Now, moving outside of the top 10 finishes, let's quickly discuss Alex Albon, who came home in P11. I just don't think he had enough pace to keep the Haas drivers behind today, but he still looked good. The most important thing was he obviously kept the car out of the wall. There was no damage. The last thing he wanted to do was then wreck the car, damage the chassis, and then he's damaged both chassis. That would not be a good look for him or the team or Logan Sargent. Maybe he could have got points today with a slightly better strategy. I must admit I wasn't following his race too closely, but I doubt it. Obviously, the swap between the team didn't pay off because they didn't get points, so you could argue that there was no point in really swapping the drivers over, but we won't really know. I still think Albon maximised the potential of the car, though. Ricciardo came home in P12, and his race pace in comparison to Tsunoda, I think, was actually quite decent. When they were both in clean air, they were running very similar laps. The gap was sneaking around 10 seconds, but it was his bad qualifying that ruined any chance he may have had of points. Yes, he might have been slightly quicker than the cars ahead on race pace, but you can't expect to drive through the field in a car that's only half a tenth quicker on average per lap than the cars ahead. You need a much bigger pace advantage. He needs to sort out his qualifying if he wants to be able to keep up with the way that Tsunoda is delivering, and he's not doing himself any favours at the moment in fighting for that Red Bull seat. Finally, you move to the very, very back where you had Gasly, Bottas, Zhou and Ocon rounding out the finishes of the race. Alpine just didn't have any performance once again, and the drivers just can't do anything with a car that is slowest of all. And whilst I think the Stake was quicker than the Alpine this weekend, they keep having pit stop dramas. A slow pit stop for both Zhou and Bottas. They really need to fix this up. These drivers just seem to be in a race of their own today. They would flash past with Bottas chasing Gasly and Ocon chasing Zhou 20 seconds after all the other cars have disappeared, and both teams need a big step in performance on and off the track going forward. So, that's the Australian Grand Prix, and whilst I think the race was overall probably the best race we've had so far this season, I do think it was better than Bahrain and Saudi. By no means was it a classic, but there were some interesting moments throughout, some talking points to take away. We had a different winner, which is always nice. I'm always interested if it is a different winner. Just on a side note, the stands were very much cheering when Verstappen DNF'd. That felt a bit wrong. I don't want someone to be winning because someone else DNF'd from the lead of the race. I think it would have been interesting to see the pace comparison between the Red Bull and Ferrari this weekend. So I was disappointed that Verstappen DNF'd. Of course, the crowd was always going to cheer, especially when Carlos Sainz took the lead. But I mean, I wish we did have some closer racing. It's always nice to have a different winner, but the race did feel a bit lackluster just with the way it ended up panning out. I'd probably give it a solid 6.5, maybe 7 out of 10, just pushing a 7. I don't think it was anything really spectacular. Next time out, though, we go to Japan. We go to Suzuka, the only track that is figure 8 in design. It's very cool, very fast. It's got the amazing Sector 1. It's got the very fast 130R. I love Japan. It's one of my favorite tracks. Last time out, though, Verstappen did end up dominating. He had just lost the Singapore Grand Prix and rebounded quite extensively. He beat Norris by 20 seconds, who came home P2. So fingers crossed we don't get a result like that in 2 weeks' time and we get a nice competitive race with some good racing, but you can only wish. But thank you all for tuning in, and let me know what you would rate the race out of 10 below. Have a great rest of your day.